somewhat unfortunately, follow the news pretty closely. And I've been reading, article after article after article about what people are mad about, right? And well, they're certainly mad about a number of things. It seems like Bannon has successfully gotten across. Sorry, Stephen Miller rather has successfully gotten across his idea of saturation, right? Which is just do stuff, right? Do a lot of things to kind of confuse the opposition, right? To kind of flood the radar with signals,
Mhm.
and seems like that's working. But one of the common lines of attack, right, opposing this progress is exactly this, right? Complaining about the bureaucracy being taken away. And I think it's because the left has realized that is an immense base of their power, right? That is how they get a lot of things done. And you in the finance world certainly know this, but anyone who's at all interested in guns or cars or really anything that the government has an interest in also realizes that the unaccountable bureaucracy, right? These kind of like faceless office people decide quite a lot about your life. And if you have that on side, you can really do a lot, right? You can legislate without legislatures. You can rule without a ruler. And so again, right, I'm not making some kind of grand proclamation about, Trump you know, will kind of like remake America into, a golden empire. It's not what I'm saying. But if you were playing the game and playing it seriously, you would have to go after the bureaucracy. And it seems like someone is. And again, our enemies are reacting negatively and not in the kind of like hysterical tones that you hear about when leftists are kind of enjoying it, right? When they like the process of being hyped up. It seems like this is actually hurting them. And one of the other things that has become a rallying point, right, is the phrase "Who elected Elon Musk?" Right, the idea that Elon Musk is the real president, the real power. And so I've spent a lot of time analyzing the different factions at play here. So I'm curious, right? Do you see this kind of like remaking of the economy, remaking of the bureaucracy? Do you see that as being exclusively downstream of Peter Thiel and his tech bros?
Yeah, not to, I always kind of dread that it comes across as like I'm glazing them, as the kids say. But I think they've thought about that very seriously. And and Mark Andreessen too. This is certainly where they've honed their skills, right? In terms of venture capital, making bets that pay off, seeing the way that things could be as opposed to the way that they are, and how do you get from point A to point B to realize that? And I think that Trump has attracted that crowd, and Elon's kind of a quintessential example of this, of, well, if you are going to pull it off, what does that look like? How does it have to get done? And this is a genuine form of the circulation of elites. That managerial regime where it was done through the credit facility and buying loyalty and led to a lot of stagnation. Finally, and just like we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, basically it reached a point where the nation could no longer feed itself, and people were at a breaking point where they were willing to take anything has to be better than this. And I think that's what they're playing into. But to your point, they're playing it very smart of, okay, well, or like the Spanish Civil War, if our enemies are unable to feed their people, we actually do have to feed our people in order to be the more compelling case. Or the Chinese Communist Party, this is always what they worry about as well, is, okay, well, if we're going to stay in power, we actually have to deliver on our promises of making quality of life better. And as soon as we falter, we notice that we start getting protests in the street, and people become very disaffected, and they lose their inertia or their mandate. Yeah, I think that's where they're coming from with this, is how would you actually do this? And that they have the financial chops of understanding both the structure of the current regime as well as what a viable replacement is. And a big part of that, and something we talk about all the time on the right, is, I mean, there's a lot of like, well, where's my Teal bucks, or where's my Elon bucks? And then sometimes that gets diffused with, well, you can't just expect to be given handouts, which is completely fair, especially on the right, even though from USAID, people do just get handouts because they, promise to make, trans children's books or whatever. But for us, it has to be aligned to competency, but also that there has to be that war chest. There has to be those funds available to actually make those investments. And the other regime was very careful about gatekeeping who could be awarded that money and who couldn't. And that's a big part of going back to like David Graeber's bullshit jobs. You've probably heard me rant before. I've always had this question of like, well, where is all this money coming from? How do all these people have so much money? They don't do anything. They admit that they don't do anything, and yet they don't stress over how do I afford a home or how do I pay my bills or how can I possibly afford to start a family, like anybody else who's outside of that system. And so, yes, uh, shutting down that system is a necessary part of that, but also to be able to sustainably fund replacement people from our guys to create that. Yeah, I think they're doing it in the same way. It's the national scale version of Peter Thiel's Founders Fund.
It's a really interesting thing. I'm glad you brought up USAID. I was actually talking to my grandparents about this last night. And the two of us were saying exactly what you did. Who in the world was paying for this? And again, I've had my suspicions, right? That all of this was just funded by the government, right? Because there was no clear answer, right? Okay, some of it was coming from NGOs, but even that doesn't make a ton of sense, right? Like why is JP Morgan Chase or why is, any one of these big companies giving money to, some random little, feminist art project in, Dearborn, Michigan, right? Something like that doesn't make sense until you realize, oh, wait, this is all a giant scam, right? This is all just a kind of elaborate influence peddling operation. And Z-Man on his most recent episode actually did a very good discussion of the kind of like the corruption of NGOs and charities. And I'll put it this way, it's a little bit, it makes you feel good, right? When you realize you're beating people who, don't just have a little bit of support, but have, millions and millions of dollars given them for free to fight you, and they're still losing, right? Like these people are absolutely pathetic.